I forgave the people who tried to erase me from my own life. And that was the day I finally stopped hurting. I didn't forgive them because they apologized. They didn't. I didn't forgive them because they understood what they had done. They still don't. I forgave them because I was tired of carrying something that was slowly hollowing me out from the inside. 3 years ago, I was standing at my husband's graveside, my black coat too thin for the March wind in Columbus, Ohio, listening to the pastor talk about devotion and legacy. Robert and I had been married for 46 years. We built our life in a modest 2-story home with white siding and a maple tree in the front yard that he planted when our son, Daniel, was 5. I remember watching that tree grow the way I watched my boy grow, slowly, stubbornly, beautifully. At the funeral, Daniel stood beside his wife, Olivia, her hand looped neatly through his arm. She wore pearl earrings and a calm expression that looked almost rehearsed. When the service ended and people drifted away with paper plates of casserole and quiet condolences, Olivia leaned toward Daniel and whispered something. He nodded. That was the first time I noticed the distance. Not the physical kind, the emotional kind. The kind that feels like someone quietly stepping back while you're still reaching forward. A week later, we sat at my dining room table. The house still smelled faintly like Robert's aftershave. His reading glasses were on the kitchen counter where he'd left them the night before his heart gave out. I hadn't moved them. I wasn't ready. Olivia cleared her throat and said, "It's time to make practical decisions." Practical. That word landed like cold metal. Daniel didn't look at me when he added, "The house is a lot for you, Mom. It might be better to downsize." Better. Another careful word. I remember tracing the grain of the oak table with my finger, the same table where Daniel used to do his homework, where we celebrated birthdays with chocolate cake and candles that dripped wax onto paper plates. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply listened as they talked about square footage, maintenance costs, and retirement communities as if they were discussing a storage unit instead of my home. Within 2 months, the house was listed. Olivia handled the realtor. Daniel handled the paperwork. I signed where they told me to sign. They assured me it was for my own good. "You'll have activities," Olivia said brightly. "People your age. It'll be easier." Easier. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in a senior complex 20 miles away. The living room measured maybe 12 by 15 feet. The window overlooked a parking lot. On my first night there, I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of a television in the next unit. I realized then that grief comes in layers. There was the grief of losing my husband. And then there was the quieter grief of realizing I had lost my place in my own family. Daniel called less often. Olivia sent polite texts on holidays. I became someone they checked on instead of someone they leaned on. And for a long time, I carried a tightness in my chest that never quite eased. I replayed conversations in my head. I wondered what I had missed. I wondered when I became optional. The anger wasn't loud. It was steady. It sat beside me in that small apartment like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. I told myself I was fine. I joined a book club. I volunteered at the local library twice a week, shelving returns and helping children find their favorite series. I smiled. I functioned. But at night, when the hallway lights dimmed and the building grew quiet, the questions came back. Why hadn't my son fought for me the way I had always fought for him? Why had it been so easy for them to redraw the map of my life without asking if I wanted to move? The day I forgave them didn't begin with a grand speech or a dramatic confrontation. It began with a phone call. Daniel's voice sounded strained, thinner than I remembered. "Mom," he said, "I need to talk to you." And as I held that phone to my ear, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not vindication, but clarity. I suddenly understood that holding on to resentment had tied me to the worst version of that story. And I was ready, finally, to write a different ending for myself. Daniel did not waste time with small talk. His voice carried a tension I had never heard before, not. Even when he was a teenager calling to admit he had dented the family car. He asked if he could come by the apartment that evening. I told him he could. I hung up and sat very still at my small kitchen table, the one I had bought secondhand when I moved in, barely 3 feet across. Outside my window, a delivery truck backed into a parking space, the beeping echoing against the brick walls of the complex. I folded my hands and waited. When Daniel arrived, he looked older than his 45 years. The confident posture he had worn for most of his adult life had softened into something uncertain. He did not bring Olivia. That told me more than his words ever could. He sat across from me, knees almost touching mine because there was not much room. He glanced around at the apartment, at the beige walls, the single-framed photograph of his father on the bookshelf, the crocheted blanket folded neatly over the arm of my sofa. I watched him take in the reality of where I lived now. He cleared his throat and began explaining that his business had hit a difficult season. A contract had fallen through. A partner had pulled out. Payments were late. The mortgage on their 4-bedroom home in Dublin was 3 months behind. He said the numbers quickly, as if speed might soften them. $120,000 would stabilize everything. He said he hated to ask, but I was the only person he trusted. I listened without interrupting. I noticed how carefully he avoided mentioning the house they had sold, the one with the maple tree in the front yard. He spoke about opportunity, about how this was temporary, about how he would pay me back with interest. I could hear the strain beneath the confidence. When he finally stopped talking, the apartment felt even smaller. I asked him a simple question. I asked him whether he had been happy when I signed the papers to leave my home. He looked startled, as if the past had walked into the room uninvited. He said it was not like that. He said they thought it was best for me. He said Olivia believed I would thrive with community and structure. I nodded slowly. I told him that I had indeed found community. I told him about the book club that met every Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon, and the children at the library who called me Miss Evelyn and asked for help finding mystery novels. I told him I had learned how to live in a smaller space and how to carry my own groceries up one flight of stairs without assistance. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply described my life as it was. Daniel stared at his hands. For the first time, I saw something like doubt cross his face. Not guilt exactly, but the beginning of awareness. He said he never meant for me to feel pushed aside. He said he thought I would understand that they were trying to protect me from stress. I let the silence stretch between us. Silence can be more revealing than anger. I realized then that my resentment had kept me tied to that dining room table, to those careful words about practicality. It had kept me waiting for an apology that might never come. I inhaled slowly and felt a surprising calm settle over me. I told my son that I forgave him. I said the words clearly, so there would be no confusion. I told him I forgave Olivia too. His head snapped up, searching my face for sarcasm or hidden conditions. There were none. I explained that forgiveness did not mean I would forget what had happened, and it did not mean I would rearrange my life again to rescue his. It meant I was choosing not to let that chapter define me any longer. I told him I would not be lending him money. I said it gently, without apology. The color drained from his face, but I kept my tone steady. I reminded him that he was capable, that he had built his company once before and could rebuild it again. I told him I believed in his strength more than I believed in writing a check. For a long moment, he did not speak. Then he nodded, slowly, as if absorbing a lesson he had not expected to learn in his mother's modest apartment. When he left, the room did not feel as tight as it once had. The walls had not moved, but something inside me had. I washed the 2 coffee mugs we had used and placed them carefully in the cabinet. The parking lot lights flickered on outside, casting a soft glow through the blinds. I sat down in my armchair and felt a quiet steadiness settle in my chest. I had not regained my old house. I had not rewritten the past. But I had reclaimed something more important. I had reclaimed the right to choose how much space their decisions occupied in my heart. The next morning I woke before sunrise, not because of anxiety, but because of habit. For decades I had risen early to pack lunches, to iron shirts, to make coffee before Robert left for work. Now the apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a garbage truck making its rounds. I lay in bed for a moment and noticed something unfamiliar. The tightness that had lived in my chest for years was lighter. Not gone entirely, but loosened, as if someone had untied a knot I had grown used to carrying. I made my bed carefully, smoothing the quilt with both hands, then brewed a single cup of coffee in the small machine on my counter. The aroma filled the kitchen and drifted into the living room. I carried the mug to the window and watched the sky shift from pale gray to soft blue over the parking lot. Nothing outside had changed. The same cars sat in the same spaces. The same sidewalk curved around the building. And yet everything inside me felt slightly rearranged. Around 10 in the morning my phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. He thanked me for seeing him the night before. He said he had a lot to think about. The message was shorter than the ones he used to send when he needed something, but it felt more honest. I read it once and set the phone down without immediately crafting a reply. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel the urge to manage his emotions or rush in to fix what was broken. I let the silence sit between us, not as punishment, but as space for him to stand on his own. That afternoon, I walked to the community center 2 blocks away for book club. The air was cool, about 55 degrees, and the maple trees along the sidewalk were beginning to show early signs of autumn. I thought about the tree in my old front yard and felt a brief ache, but it did not swallow me the way it once had. Inside the community room, a circle of folding chairs waited. Marjorie waved at me from across the room, her silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. We discussed a novel about second chances, about people who learn to rebuild their lives after unexpected turns. As the others spoke, I realized I was not just listening to them. I was listening to myself. I was noticing how my voice sounded steadier when I shared my thoughts. I was noticing how I no longer introduced my story with the word unfortunately. When I returned to my apartment later that evening, there was another message from Daniel. This time he said he had scheduled a meeting with his financial advisor to explore options. He said he did not want to depend on me. I read those words twice. I felt something close to pride, but I did not let it swell into control. I simply whispered a quiet prayer for his resilience and placed the phone back on the table. Forgiveness, I was learning, is not a single moment. It is a series of small choices made over and over again. It is choosing not to reopen old arguments in your mind while brushing your teeth. It is choosing not to rehearse speeches in the shower. It is choosing to wish someone well without attaching yourself to the outcome. That night, I pulled out a small wooden box from my dresser, the one that held Robert's letters from our early years of marriage. I read one dated June of 1979, where he wrote about building a life that felt solid and kind. I realized that the life we built was not contained within the walls of a house. It was carried inside me, in the values I had lived by and the love I had given without keeping score. I closed the box gently and returned it to the drawer. I did not need Daniel to restore my sense of worth. I did not need Olivia to understand what she had taken from me. I had already taken back the only thing that truly mattered. I had taken back my peace. And in that quiet apartment, under the soft glow of a single lamp, I understood that healing is not loud. It is steady. It is the calm that settles in when you finally stop waiting for someone else to change. Weeks passed with a steadiness I had not felt in years. Daniel did not call every day, and I did not wait for him to. Sometimes he sent short updates about meetings with his bank or adjustments to his business plan. The messages were practical, focused, almost humble. I answered with encouragement, not solutions. I resisted the old instinct to ask for spreadsheets, to calculate outcomes, to offer to cover what was missing. It surprised me how much strength it required to do nothing. One Saturday afternoon, he asked if he could visit again. This time Olivia came with him. When I opened the door, she stood half a step behind Daniel, her posture composed but less polished than before. She carried a small bouquet of grocery store flowers wrapped in clear plastic. I invited them inside. The apartment felt different than it had months ago. Not larger, but more lived in. A new throw pillow rested on the sofa. A stack of library books sat neatly on the coffee table. Olivia glanced around as if seeing the space for the first time without comparing it to something else. We sat close together again because there was not much room. Daniel spoke first. He said they were restructuring their mortgage and selling a second vehicle to reduce expenses. He said they were learning hard lessons about risk and pride. Olivia listened quietly, then surprised me by speaking without being prompted. She said she had believed she was helping when she encouraged the move from my house. She said she thought efficiency and practicality were the same as care. Her voice did not tremble, but it softened at the edges. I studied her face, the careful makeup, the controlled expression. I realized she was not cruel. She was afraid. Afraid of instability, of loss, of anything that felt unpredictable. In her fear, she had mistaken control for protection. I told her I understood the difference now too. I told her that losing Robert had shown me how little we actually control and how much damage we cause when we try to manage everything around us. There were no dramatic apologies, no tears, just a quiet exchange of recognition. We spoke about ordinary things after that. The book club selection for the month. The new coffee shop opening near their neighborhood. The weather turning cooler. When they stood to leave, Olivia handed me the flowers. I placed them in a simple glass vase on the kitchen counter after they walked out. That evening, I noticed something else had shifted. I no longer felt the need to replay every word of our conversation, searching for hidden meanings. I accepted it for what it was, imperfect but honest. Forgiveness had not rewritten history, but it had softened the sharpest edges. A few days later, Daniel called again. He said they had found a buyer for the extra vehicle and were negotiating with the bank in good faith. He thanked me, not for money, but for believing he could stand on his own. I felt a quiet warmth spread through me, not pride in a dramatic sense, but the steady satisfaction of watching someone grow without being pulled by my hand. That night, I took a longer walk than usual, nearly a mile around the complex and down the neighboring street lined with modest ranch homes. The air was crisp, and porch lights flickered on as the sun dipped below the horizon. I thought about the woman I had been a year earlier, sitting in this same apartment, measuring her worth against a house she no longer owned. I almost did not recognize her. The healing had not come from their change alone. It had come from my decision to stop tying my identity to their approval. As I returned to my building and climbed the single flight of stairs, I realized that forgiveness had created room. Room for conversation without resentment. Room for boundaries without bitterness. Room for love that did not require control. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind me. The apartment felt steady and calm, not temporary, not like a compromise, but like a place that belonged to me. And for the first time since Robert passed, I felt that my life was not shrinking. It was simply unfolding in a quieter, more deliberate way. By the time winter settled over Columbus, the rhythm of my days felt settled as well. The maple trees outside the complex had shed their leaves, and the sidewalks were lined with thin patches of frost in the early mornings. I began volunteering an extra shift at the library on Thursdays, helping organize donated books and guiding parents toward the children's reading corner. The routine grounded me. It reminded me that usefulness is not measured by how much money you can provide, but by the steadiness of your presence. Daniel called one evening just after dinner. His voice sounded different again, but not strained this time. There was a measured confidence beneath his words. He told me the bank had agreed to restructure the loan, and he had secured a smaller contract that would keep his company afloat while he rebuilt. He did not speak quickly. He did not oversell hope. He simply laid out the facts. When he finished, there was a brief silence, and then he said something that caught me off guard. He said, "Mom, I should have asked what you wanted back then." The sentence was simple, but it carried weight. I leaned back in my chair and looked around my apartment, at the lamp casting a soft circle of light on the wall, at the framed photograph of Robert smiling from the bookshelf. I realized that I did not need to revisit every detail of that decision. I did not need to dissect it. I only needed to acknowledge the truth in his words. I told him I appreciated hearing that. I told him that sometimes we think we are solving a problem when we are really avoiding discomfort. He was quiet for a moment, then he agreed. A few days later, Daniel and Olivia invited me to dinner at their home. I had not been back since I moved out of the old house and into this apartment. As I drove the 20 miles north, I felt a flicker of memory, but not the ache that once accompanied it. Their house was larger than mine had been, with a 2-car garage and a wide front porch. Olivia opened the door before I could knock. She greeted me with a warmth that felt less rehearsed than before. The dining room table was set carefully, not extravagantly, but thoughtfully. During dinner, conversation flowed more naturally than it had in years. We spoke about books, about local news, about small renovations they were doing themselves instead of hiring contractors. I noticed how Daniel listened when I spoke, not out of obligation, but with attention. At one point, Olivia asked me about Robert's early career, about how he handled financial setbacks when Daniel was young. I told them about the year Robert's company downsized and how we cut expenses, sold unnecessary items, and leaned on faith rather than fear. I did not present the story as a lesson. I simply told it as part of our history. After dessert, Daniel walked me to my car. The cold air carried the scent of wood smoke from a neighboring chimney. He hesitated before speaking, then said he had underestimated how much strength it took for me to stand on my own. I smiled and told him that strength is often quiet. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself when needed. On the drive back to my apartment, I realized something else had shifted. I was no longer measuring our relationship against the house I lost. I was measuring it against honesty, respect, and space. Forgiveness had not erased the past, but it had created room for something steadier to grow in its place. When I returned home and hung my coat by the door, I felt no longing for larger rooms or different walls. I felt content in the space I occupied, in the life I was shaping on my own terms. The pain that once defined my evenings had softened into perspective. I understood now that healing is not about returning to what was. It is about choosing who you become after what was is gone. And in that choice, I found not only peace, but a renewed sense of dignity that no square footage could ever contain. Spring arrived quietly that year, almost without announcement. The snow melted into thin streams along the sidewalks, and the trees outside my apartment complex began to bud again. I found myself opening the windows more often, letting in the scent of damp earth and new grass. There was something about that first warm breeze that made everything feel possible. Daniel's business did not transform overnight, but it stabilized. He called me one afternoon to say he had landed a modest contract with a regional supplier. It was not the kind of deal that made headlines, but it was steady, and steady was enough. I could hear the difference in his tone now. He no longer sounded like a man asking to be rescued. He sounded like a man rebuilding. Olivia began calling occasionally as well. Sometimes she asked about recipes, sometimes about books I had mentioned, sometimes simply to check in. The conversations were not dramatic. They were ordinary, and that ordinariness felt like progress. One Saturday, they invited me to join them at a local park where a small community fair was taking place. Food trucks lined the edge of the grass, children ran with cotton candy in their hands, and a local band played soft country music near a temporary stage. I sat on a folding chair under a blue sky and watched families move around me. At one point, Daniel handed me a lemonade and sat beside me without speaking. We listened to the music together. There was no tension in the silence, only comfort. I realized then that forgiveness had not diminished my authority in their lives. It had refined it. I was no longer the emergency solution. I was the steady presence. Later that afternoon, Olivia thanked me for giving them space to figure things out. She said she had been raised to believe that security came from controlling outcomes, from planning every detail. She admitted that when Robert died, she panicked at the idea of instability spreading through the family. Moving me had felt, to her, like tightening a loose bolt. She had not seen that she was loosening something else in the process. I listened without interruption. I told her that fear often disguises itself as efficiency. We sat on a wooden bench while children chased each other across the grass, and for the first time I sensed that she was not measuring me against practicality anymore. She was seeing me as a person who had endured loss and chosen steadiness over resentment. That evening, when I returned to my apartment, I felt neither superior nor triumphant. I felt balanced. I prepared a simple dinner of baked chicken and roasted vegetables, set one place at my small table, and ate slowly. The room was quiet, but not lonely. I thought about how different this space felt compared to the day I first moved in. It had once seemed like evidence of displacement. Now it felt like evidence of independence. The next week, Daniel sent me a photo of the maple tree in front of their house, its leaves just beginning to fill out. He wrote that it reminded him of the tree in our old yard. I looked at the image for a long moment. Instead of sadness, I felt continuity. Trees grow where they are planted. Sometimes we do too. I responded with a simple message wishing them well. I did not offer advice. I did not revisit old wounds. I trusted that what needed to be understood had already been spoken. As the days grew longer and the light lingered later into the evening, I recognized a truth that had taken me years to accept. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not excusing. It is releasing the expectation that the past will be rewritten. In releasing that expectation, I discovered a quieter strength. I could sit in my modest apartment, with its single bedroom and narrow hallway, and feel as rooted as I once did in a larger house. The measure of my life was no longer defined by what I had lost, but by how I chose to live after loss. And in that choice, I found a peace that did not depend on anyone else's approval. Summer settled over Ohio with long evenings and soft golden light that stretched past 8:30. The air felt thicker now, warm against my skin as I walked the familiar path around the apartment complex. The trees were fully green again, and the scent of cut grass lingered near the sidewalks. I had begun to notice how comfortable my steps felt, how I no longer walked as if I were searching for something I had lost. Instead, I walked because I enjoyed the rhythm of movement, the quiet hum of cicadas rising as dusk approached. Daniel's company continued to rebuild, slowly but steadily. He spoke more about strategy now than survival. He mentioned trimming unnecessary expenses, focusing on long-term clients instead of chasing fast growth. I listened with interest, but without attachment. When he described setbacks, I did not rush to solve them. When he shared successes, I did not claim them. I allowed him to own his story. Olivia began stopping by occasionally on weekday afternoons when she had errands nearby. Sometimes she brought coffee. Sometimes she brought nothing but conversation. One afternoon, she helped me rearrange a small bookshelf in the living room. As we moved the furniture a few inches to the left, she laughed and said she had never realized how little space it takes to feel content. I looked around at the 12 by 15-foot living room, at the single armchair and modest sofa, and I smiled. Contentment, I had learned, is not measured in square footage. It is measured in clarity. There was a moment later that month that confirmed how much had changed. Daniel called to tell me they were considering selling their large house and moving into something smaller, something more manageable. He asked my opinion. Not for permission, not for financial support, just for perspective. I told him that houses are tools, not trophies. They should serve the life you are building, not the image you are trying to project. He thanked me and said he understood that differently now. After I hung up, I sat quietly and felt an unexpected wave of gratitude. The conversation did not revolve around crisis. It revolved around intention. That evening, I pulled out Robert's old toolbox from the closet. It had followed me from the house to this apartment, tucked behind winter coats and spare linens. I opened it and ran my fingers over the worn handles of the tools. Robert used to say that repairs should be done carefully, not quickly. That rushing only hides cracks instead of fixing them. I realized our family had tried to rush through grief, through fear, through discomfort. In doing so, we had cracked something important. But cracks, if tended with patience, can strengthen a structure instead of weakening it. A week later, Daniel and Olivia invited me to a small dinner with two of Daniel's business partners. I hesitated at first, unsure whether I belonged in that space. But when I arrived, Daniel introduced me not as someone who had supported him financially, but as someone who had taught him resilience. The words were simple, but they carried respect. I sat at the table, listening to discussions about market trends and client relationships, and I did not feel displaced. I felt present. As the night ended and I drove back to my apartment, the sky was deep blue, nearly indigo. The city lights shimmered faintly on the horizon. I realized that my healing had moved beyond the moment of decision. It had become a way of living. I no longer replayed the sale of the house in my mind. I no longer imagined alternative outcomes. I accepted that the past had unfolded as it did, and that from it, something steadier had grown. In the quiet of my apartment later that night, I turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the darkness. I felt neither bitterness nor triumph. I felt balance. The kind that comes when you stop trying to reclaim what was taken and start investing in who you are becoming. And in that balance, I understood that forgiveness had not only repaired a relationship, it had reshaped my understanding of strength itself. By late August, the air carried a faint hint of change, even though the afternoons were still warm. The light shifted earlier in the evening, stretching long shadows across the parking lot outside my window. I found myself thinking less about what had happened and more about what I wanted the next few years of my life to look like. For the first time since Robert passed, my thoughts about the future did not feel uncertain. They felt deliberate. Daniel and Olivia had listed their house for sale. It was not a desperate decision. It was intentional. They had chosen a smaller place closer to Daniel's office, something manageable, something practical without being performative. When Daniel told me they had accepted an offer, his voice carried calm instead of panic. He said they were learning that success does not always mean expansion. Sometimes it means alignment. I listened and realized he was no longer chasing stability through size. He was building it through discipline. A few weeks later, they invited me to see the new house. It was modest, a single story with 3 bedrooms and a narrow backyard. The kitchen was smaller than the one in their previous home, but sunlight poured through the windows in the late afternoon. Olivia walked me through each room, explaining how they planned to decorate, where they would place bookshelves, how they wanted a guest room that felt welcoming rather than formal. When she said guest room, She looked directly at me. There was no pressure in her gaze, only invitation. I ran my hand lightly along the edge of the kitchen counter and felt no comparison rise in my chest. I did not measure it against the house I once owned. I saw it for what it was, a new chapter they were choosing together. As we stood in the backyard, Daniel admitted that losing the larger house felt like shedding an image he had worked hard to maintain. He said he had confused growth with scale. I told him that real growth often looks smaller from the outside and stronger from the inside. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing the lesson not as a correction but as perspective. When I returned to my apartment that evening, I felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. Not because my circumstances were changing, but because I realized I had permission to change as well. I began researching travel groups designed for seniors who wanted structured trips without complicated planning. I found a program offering a week-long coastal tour in North Carolina the following spring. The idea of seeing the ocean again stirred something gentle and hopeful inside me. I registered without asking anyone's opinion. I informed Daniel afterward, not for approval but to share excitement. He responded with genuine enthusiasm. Olivia offered to drive me to the airport when the time came. I smiled at the shift in dynamic. I was no longer orbiting their life. We were moving forward in parallel, intersecting when it felt natural. One quiet evening, as I organized old photographs into a new album, I paused over a picture of Robert standing beneath the maple tree in our old yard. I did not feel a rush of sorrow. I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the years we had. Gratitude for the resilience that followed. Gratitude that I had chosen to release resentment before it defined the rest of my life. The apartment around me felt steady and sufficient. The furniture was simple. The walls were plain. But the atmosphere was peaceful. I understood now that forgiveness had never been about excusing what happened. It had been about refusing to let a painful season become my permanent identity. As summer leaned toward fall and the evenings grew cooler, I noticed how naturally joy returned in small forms. A phone call filled with laughter. A shared meal without tension. A plan for a future trip. None of it was dramatic. All of it was meaningful. I turned off the light beside my chair and looked around the room once more before going to bed. I felt rooted, not in a particular house, but in myself. And that rootedness did not depend on what anyone else chose to do. It depended on the decision I had made to let go and move forward with clarity, strength, and quiet. Confidence. The following spring arrived with a brightness that felt almost symbolic. I boarded a plane for North Carolina on a clear April morning, carrying a single suitcase that weighed less than 40 pounds and a sense of quiet anticipation. The airport felt busy, full of hurried conversations and rolling luggage, but I moved through it calmly. I was not escaping anything. I was stepping toward something. When the plane lifted off the runway, I looked down at the patchwork of neighborhoods below and felt no pull of regret. Columbus had been the setting of my loss and my rebuilding, but it was no longer the boundary of my life. The coastal air greeted me with salt and warmth when I arrived. The ocean stretched wide and steady, blue meeting sky without interruption. I stood on the sand that first evening, shoes in hand, and let the tide wash lightly over my feet. The water was cool, grounding. I thought about how many seasons had passed since Robert's death, how many nights I had sat in a quiet apartment wrestling with anger and confusion. I realized that none of it had been wasted. Each moment had shaped the clarity I carried now. During that week, I joined small group tours along the shoreline, visited lighthouses, and sat on wooden benches watching fishing boats move slowly across the horizon. I spoke with other travelers, women and men who had also experienced change, who had also learned that life does not pause when something ends. In the evenings, I wrote brief notes in a small journal, not about what I had lost, but about what I was discovering. I discovered that my laughter came easily again. I discovered that solitude can feel expansive rather than empty. I discovered that forgiveness had opened space for curiosity instead of resentment. One afternoon, as I walked along a boardwalk lined with weathered planks, Daniel called. He asked about the ocean, about the weather, about the food. His voice carried warmth, not obligation. He told me their new house was settling in, that Olivia had planted a small tree in the backyard. I smiled at the symmetry. I told him the ocean was vast and steady, and that it reminded me how small our fears can be when placed beside something enduring. After we ended the call, I leaned against the railing and watched the waves roll in. I understood then that forgiveness had not changed them first. It had changed me. It had shifted my focus from what was done to me toward what I was still capable of becoming. When I returned to Ohio a week later, my apartment felt welcoming rather than confining. I unpacked slowly, placing a small seashell on the bookshelf beside Robert's photograph. It did not replace anything. It represented continuation. Daniel and Olivia came over for dinner the following Sunday. I prepared a simple meal, set 3 plates at my modest table, and listened as they described their plans with a sense of balance I had not heard before. There was no mention of crisis, no undercurrent of blame. There was simply conversation. As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave, Daniel hugged me a little longer than usual. I did not analyze the gesture. I accepted it. After they drove away, I washed the dishes and turned off the lights one by one. Standing alone in the quiet, I felt neither lonely nor triumphant. I felt whole. The past remained part of my story, but it no longer dictated the tone of my days. I had learned that healing is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is the steady realization that you can release what wounded you without releasing yourself. And in that realization, I found a life that felt rooted, open, and entirely my own.